The White Sox are starting to open up roster spots. Now let's see if they can wisely fill them.
You are Locked On White Sox, your daily Chicago White Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I'm your host, Todd Welter, a lifelong Sox fan. I've been podcasting here for over a year and a half and covering the team well before then. And also I've covered Major League Baseball for outlets such as the Associated Press. And thanks for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, the White Sox cleared out 5 roster spots yesterday. Let's discuss why it's important and how the White Sox must fill those open spots wisely, along with some other players they need to clear out. And then let's do 2 mailbag questions and comment segments. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. If your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Download the app today. Well, the White Sox outrighted outfielders Corey Julks and Dominic Fletcher, along with pitchers Elvis Bergoya and Owen White. And Will Robinson was claimed off of waivers by the Pirates. Nothing startling there. All 4 that got outrighted, they're basically organizational depth players, 4A players. They're good enough to play in AAA as long as they would like. They don't have to start learning how to sell insurance or real estate. But at the same time, they're just not good enough, or at least productive enough, to stay on a 26-man roster permanently. And losing Robertson, not the end of the world, as he did look the part of a slugger, but he couldn't make contact at the big league level. Had a 133 average in 24 games for the White Sox. So let the Pirates deal with the false hope, because that's what Will Robertson is. He's false hope. Nice depth guy to have, just like having Corey Julks and Dominic Fletcher. And I think the White Sox were trying to get Will Robertson through waivers to get him outrighted to still keep him in the organizational fold, but it just didn't work out that way. But these moves had to be made, not only to start getting ready for the offseason, but to also make sure some of these top pitching prospects that the White Sox have can be added to the 40-man roster to avoid being Rule 5 draft eligible. And since they won't be having a major spending offseason, they have to wisely use these roster spots that they're creating, to get the upgrades they need to at least, make the starting rotation a little bit better next season and get better in high leverage bullpen situations, that type of stuff. Because those are really the upgrades they definitely need to get. But they have to, start clearing out the roster spots to make those upgrades and to also keep certain guys from being poached in the Rule 5 draft. Now, the White Sox are also going to pick up 3 more roster spots to work with once Tyler Alexander and Miguel Castro become free agents. I don't think they're exercising Martin Perez's $10 million option, so I think that likely gets declined. Although I would leave it at 50-50 that he returns on a cheaper deal, but that will still clear up 3 more roster spots, so that gets you down to 32. They should non-tender Derek Hill and Ben Cowles, 2 late season additions. So that puts you at 30. However, they have to add Drew Thorpe, Kai Busch, and Prelander Baroa back to the 40-man roster after missing the season with Tommy John surgery until, spring training, because the 60-day IL ends once the season is concluded. So they have to go back onto the 40-man roster, at least temporarily, before you can put them back on the injured list once spring training starts. And I think that's where they're going to start. It's very rare for a pitcher to come back a year to the date from Tommy John surgery. Kai Busch, I think, could be back maybe by May or June if you're optimistic, considering he had his surgery in February. But Thorpe, I think, had it in early April, and Baroa the same way. So, those guys will probably have to go back on the 60-man. So it's just a temporary, they have to park them there. But, again, if you make those non-tender decisions, and even if you non-tender Mike Tauchman and Steven Wilson, then you're gaining 2 more spots. But again, I've talked about on previous shows where I think you should bring back Tauchman at least as the 4th outfielder, or again, the bridge right fielder. But you're basically looking at right now 7 available 40-man roster spots then. And that number dwindles then because you got to add at least pitching prospect Tanner McDougal. That would be the wise thing to do because he's your number 7 prospect per MLB pipeline, and he's still 22. And with the stuff he has, he's easily taken in the Rule 5 this draft this year. I'd make the case that the Rockies would probably want to take him with the number 1 overall pick in the Rule 5 draft. I think they should also add Peyton Pallette for the velocity potential he can provide to the bullpen. Aldrin Batista, he's a top 30 prospect, and he's still 22. So you don't want to give up on him, and he's Rule 5 draft eligible. Shane Murphy, now he isn't a top 30 pitcher, top 30 prospect, but pitching director Brian Bannister loves his stuff, and I think he could be a good back-end lefty in the rotation, especially, if you do decide to trade Davis Martin at some point during this rebuild, during the phases, to maybe, package him to get maybe a center fielder of the future with, say, like a Lenyn Sosa, again, package, that type of stuff. But basically, you got to add those guys. So now you're at 37, and you still got to add, like I said, at least 2 starting pitchers, and I would say at least 3 bullpen arms, potentially, maybe 2 if you are finally ready to give Peyton Pallette a shot. But still, as of right now, you're entering the offseason with then basically 37 players on your 40-man roster that you're going to add. Plus, this is where it gets tricky then. Mason Adams, he's Rule 5 draft eligible. He's the team's number 13 prospect. And Tyler Schweitzer, the team's number 29 prospect, is also Rule 5 eligible. Now, they could gamble on no team wanting to touch Adams coming off of Tommy John surgery. I think that is a pretty good gamble to take. He will be recovering. He probably should be ready at some point this season, but I don't see some of these fellow peers in bad being like, okay, well, we'll get him and then we'll just stash him. You can stash him, I believe, on the 15-day IL, but then there's the potential that he's just not going to be available at all this year. Because sometimes it takes guys 2 years to get back. And again, he's more of a spin guy. And if the White Sox showed you anything, like if they showed the Rockies anything or some of these other fellow peers in bad, you go for guys like Shane Smith at the top of the Rule 5 draft. I don't see contenders being like, you know what, let's go get Mason Adams. It's possible. That's why there is a gamble on that end. And I could see them maybe not putting Schweitzer on the 40-man because he was inconsistent at AAA. And I would definitely gamble on him because while I could see him being a lefty reliever, or they did try to stretch him out again as a starter, he's 25. And you got some other lefties in the system that you can roll it down the road, especially if he's a potential lefty reliever, you could definitely use Kai Busch in that situation. And Kai Busch is 26. But again, you got to add 2 more starting pitchers, one of which I actually could see them adding in the Rule 5 draft. They should definitely, I believe they're picking 2nd this year in the Rule 5 draft. So you should definitely take advantage again of, I don't see you're going to get Shane Smith type impact player, but you got a chance to at least look around. So why not use that basically $100,000 to get a player, a guy that's pretty much close to the big leagues that just, again, you're at these situations where it comes down to remember the Brewers, it was either Shane Smith or Chad Patrick. Some of these teams will be facing these difficult decisions. So they definitely are going to have to add somebody in Rule 5. So now you're at 38. And again, you got to add 2 or 3 bullpen arms. So now you're 2 over. And that's when you got to start making some trades or just make some, difficult decisions on who else to get rid of. Well, in terms of getting upgrades and trades, I got a couple of those questions to address in this week's mailbag segment, and let's tackle that after the break. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. And that's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. Monarch is built for people with busy lives. If you put off organizing your finances, Monarch is for you. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. And I love Monarch Money because it helps me track my investments in my 401k and Roth IRA. As you know, I would like to retire someday. My wife, she loves Monarch Money because it makes doing the budget so easy and less stressful. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONMLB at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONMLB. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, make sure to hit the like button on today's episode. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox. And if you can't get the show on YouTube, you can get the audio version of the show on places such as Apple or Spotify. So make sure to follow or subscribe at wherever you get your podcasts. Either way, it gets you a 30-minute fix of Chicago White Sox baseball venting with me and maybe some hope. And also make sure to check out my written content at SouthsideSox.com, OnTapSportsNet.com, and Fans First Sports Network. I actually have a piece out on the Fans First Sports Network under Sox Populi talking about, again, why the White Sox need to be wise with these 5 roster spots that they just opened up. You know, they definitely have got to make sure that they make the right decisions when it comes to the players that they want to add to keep from being Rule 5 draft eligible, that type of stuff. And I mean, again, there's some gambles that they can take. We all thought, oh man, they're exposing Wilfred Veras to the Rule 5. Nobody took him. You know, and the difference is, though, again, pitching, I would, seeing what the White Sox did with Vassell and with Smith, and seeing again with pitching construction that you can do in pitch labs, I think it's a lot easier to still get a guy that can contribute out of the Rule 5 if you go the pitching route. So that's why it does matter this year. All right, so I got 2 Twitter questions that I want to tackle on this week's Talk You Off Tuesday segment. And one of them, the questions I got, I think it's actually hard to predict, but I'll try. And another is more of, will the White Sox do this rather than should they make the trade? So Drew Bogues, hopefully I got your name right this time. I, checked the pronunciation. I believe I got it right there. The inspiration behind calling this Talk You Off Tuesday. He asked on X for me Twitter, this is at Drew Bogues 623, who is the number 1 target actual free agent name the hashtag White Sox should try to sign this offseason? Well, to me, the number 1 target should be Munetaka Murakami out of Japan. I think he has the potential to be this rebuild's version of Jose Abreu. Now, I know MLB.com has an article up about some scouts being skeptical about holes being in his swing. He's not obviously the perfect player, but he would definitely be a guy that I would pursue just because, again, of the power potential and the fact that you, in these days at first base, you're just, again, looking for a guy that can hit a lot of bombs and just raise your talent floor. And if you can get a Pete Alonso, that would be great. But speaking of Pete Alonso and Murakami, I just don't see the White Sox, spending the money to get him since he is 25. And Murakami then isn't he basically does not fit the guidelines of international free agent. So you can't use the prospect international free agent route. And that means not only paying the posting fee, then paying whatever he needs in free agency. And then MLB.com's Mark Fine said he listed the New York Mets as one of the teams that would love to sign Murakami to replace Pete Alonso, who again could be departing in free agency. And it would be great to bring in Alonso for the sole purpose, again, of just crushing home runs for the next 3 seasons. Just provide that power boost until, the White Sox can find a first baseman of the future, whether it's in international free agency, which I always think is a great use of international free agency, to develop just a first baseman, or, even if it is like you have a couple of really good drafts. And again, the only time I think you should draft a first baseman in the first round is if they're a genetic freak like Frank Thomas or Prince Fielder, or again, that is the final piece. You've stacked up a bunch of draft classes of just high-end talent, which it looks like the White Sox have a chance to do with, Billy Carlson, then hopefully Rock Tuwalski or Justin LeBron, depending on if they win the lottery or if they're picking second. So I could see that. And then maybe you're grabbing a first baseman. And again, they got a rake too, say in the 2027, 2028 draft, not say, hey, this is, one of our main big, huge draft picks with some top 10 picks, like, Andrew Vaughn. But I just don't see them spending the money on Alonso. So actually, you guys are all going to hate it, but I would actually say the number one free agent in reality, the number one free agent target, if you just need a name, and this is just my hunch, basically using trends of some of the moves that Chris Getz has made the past 2 years, is Nestor Cortez. That's right. I think that would be a similar move of signing a lefty who's at the back end of San Diego's rotation after being traded, much like they signed Martin Perez last year. I think, it just seems like, Getz really likes the Padres system and whole. I don't know if there's something that they just identify. I mean, it is a pitcher's park. Now, he doesn't have the improved numbers like Perez had after he was traded, but when healthy, he can eat up innings. And I believe Spot Track has him projected to earn $5 million. And again, this is another reason why I would like the White Sox to shop for at least one $10 million starter. Just a little bit better. But I am fully prepared for Nestor Cortez. If you want a few more names, Dustin May. I've kind of heard that name bandied about what I've read. I know Sean Anderson kind of threw that out on the CHGO podcast. He definitely has the extension on his pitches that Brian Bannister likes, and he would come cheap, and he's still relatively young. And Adrian Hauser, wouldn't shock me if they considered him, to bring him back. But I also think, we got to wait until who the new pitching coach is, and maybe does he make a recommendation to Getz and Bannister. Then another question on X from my Twitter. This is from Lando at LaCoco149. Should Getz consider trading one of our catchers, Teal, Carroll, or even Lee? Now it should. I think the best question is would they? And I don't think so. Getz thinks catching is gold. And should they? Right now, no. I will die on this hill. I mean, I think everybody's like, hey, we should try to multiply these assets. You got to remember Carroll and Teal, and I'm very excited about them as you go back and listen to past episodes. But they're still early in their career, so we still got to define, what is their asset status. Obviously they've established that they're good players, but they still have to show they can hit for power. They still have to get better defensively. We're still early in the process where it's like, why are we just moving on so quick? And again, if we're all frustrated that the White Sox keep trading good players, stop trading good players. Also, Teal has the athleticism and college experience playing in left field. So you could technically have him be the backup catcher while getting at-bats at left field and DH. You can find him at-bats. Carroll, it might be a little bit harder because, again, he just doesn't have the athleticism, although you could maybe eventually try him at first base. And I will say this, start trying these guys at different positions when winning and losing still doesn't matter. I mean, because, yes, we would like the White Sox to win more games again next year, but just I think the expectation for everybody is don't lose 100 games again. Maybe get in that 70-win range. That's still, again, a season where wins and losses don't matter. It's now on to phase 2, internal improvement. So while it's the internal improvement, why don't you have these guys learn some of these positions that they might have to play versatility-wise when the wins and losses don't matter? Not like, hey, Andrew Vaughn, go play right field while we're in a contention window. That type of things. Also, I don't think they're going to trade Lee either, because I don't think Venable will feel comfortable having Carroll and Teal in the lineup without Lee on the 26-man roster. Because remember, he didn't start consistently putting Carroll and Lee in the lineup, one of them DHing and one of them catching, until Corey Lee was recalled. That's when he really started to feel comfortable that he could have them both in the lineup, because then he wouldn't have to sacrifice the catcher spot, the DH spot, kind of like what he did in that game against the Toronto Blue Jays. All right, I'm going to continue this mailbag segment because I got an everydayer. Bob, he sent me 3 really good emails during the week that I really want to share and I really want to tackle. So I really want to get to that after the break. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. FanDuel gives you so many ways to play. You can build parlays. You can try the player props. You can even follow the live lines during the games. FanDuel just makes watching football even more exciting when you got a little something riding on the action. And I've always been saying FanDuel's traditional money lines, the over-unders, and the spreads are fun to play. But if you want to win big money, or at least double or triple your cash, play the parlays, the props, or the futures. Now, Chicago's still ways away from making the Super Bowl, even though they beat Washington last night. But the division rival Detroit could, even though they lost to Kansas City on Sunday. But if you think Detroit will finally make it to the Super Bowl, they are at plus 400 the last time I checked to win the NFC Championship. So you can put $10 on that, and if it hits, you'll have quadrupled your money. How about putting together a futures parlay of Buffalo winning the AFC Championship game and getting the number 1 seed in the AFC playoffs? I know it doesn't look great because after they've just lost 2 straight, but that would be at plus 310. So there's a chance to triple your money if it happens. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. Welcome back to Locked On White Sox. I'm your host, Todd Welter. Again, shout out to all the everydayers. I appreciate your loyalty. Please hit the like button on today's episode. Recommend to your fellow Sox fans or baseball fans, friends, to subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On White Sox or over the other podcast, as this show is available on all major podcast platforms. All right, so getting back into the mailbag, because again, I at least once a week, it's mostly I'm going to be aiming for Tuesdays, but again, I'm going to be trying to get guests on at least once a week, and usually Tuesdays is the best days to record for me. But either way, if I don't get to it on Tuesday, I'm going to get to it on Thursday. I want to make sure your voice is read, basically, on this show so that you feel as an everydayer when you engage. Again, I will try to respond. And if you want to have an electronic pen pal, email me, lockedonwhitesox@gmail.com. I'll talk baseball with you as long as it doesn't get awkward between us. I'll make sure that I'm not weird on that, and as long as it's respectful, because again, there's nothing wrong with disagreement. Just don't be a troll. Like I literally had on the TikTok channel, just to vent really quick. I had this one guy saying, like, I was talking about, I forgot what I was talking about. It was yesterday's segment talking about, some of the stuff in the future. And I think I may have mentioned some of the stuff last season. He's like, oh, this is so reflection. Let's move forward. Yeah, the whole episode was talking about moving forward. That's the thing. If you're on TikTok, you are watching just segments usually. Go check out the whole thing before commenting. Just saying. Anyways. Well, Bob sent me a couple emails, and I want to tackle the first. This is what he suggested for the bullpen. Here's my 2026 bullpen, and the Sox can spend on an outfielder to have Tauchman be the 4th outfielder and spend on 1 to 2 starting pitchers. Here's the bullpen. Grant Taylor, Jordan Leisure, Mike Vassell, Winkleman Gonzalez, Fraser Ellard, Jonathan Cannon, Steven Wilson, Noah Schultz. Since he'll be on an innings limit, he can follow in the footsteps of Grant Taylor, Crochet, Chris Sale, and Burley by starting a career in the pen. And in July, they'll have to find places for Thorpe, Kai Bush, or Mason Adams too. Bob. All right, so I actually don't mind, not mind. I think it's a good suggestion of what you got there. I don't see Fraser Ellard being a long-term bullpen solution. He's too wild. He just does not command. He walks too many hitters, and you already have Brandon Eisert as your low leverage lefty, which I would swap those two out. I think if you have Brandon Eisert in low leverage, middle relief, even as an opener, that's a role for him. It's when you get him into high leverage, that's where it gets scary. Noah Schultz, at some point in the season, I could see them maybe doing that based on your logic. Yeah, but I don't see him starting the season out of the bullpen. I think they're going to send him back to AAA, work on getting his innings up, and then I could see them bringing him up in like July or August. Or again, if he starts to have some injuries and they just realize, his body is not going to allow him to handle the workload again, because we can all get frustrated that the White Sox are not developing certain guys that are ceilings like Grant Taylor. But if their bodies are saying, this is my ceiling, this is all I can handle, that's on the player. You can't put that on the White Sox. Okay? Because there's only so much you can do testing biologically. So if Noah Schultz's knees are having issues where he just can't handle, landing on his knee, on his legs, on his land, all that for, 140 to 160 innings, then yeah, maybe you got to make him a reliever. I think that's fine. But I think they're going to still try to develop him to his ceiling, probably get him as many innings as they can in AAA, and then eventually bring him up probably towards the end of the year. But again, it wouldn't shock me if they decide, let's, because again, if Sean Burke regains his command and masters it, and Shane Smith still continues to be the same, and Davis Martin is at least a decent fifth starter, and the 2 additions that they have, by the time that they trade him, well, you still got maybe Tanner McDougal you want to go with. Maybe what if Shane Murphy or another Rule 5 pick turns out to be the guy? Then, yeah, I could see them maybe slotting Noah Schultz in to the bullpen to at least start him before, releasing him out in the league in 2027. All right, so here's the next email he sent me. Hi, everyone keeps saying how well Vaughn is playing for the Brewers. They say that's an indictment on the White Sox. I say that's not true. If Vaughn were still on the South Side, he'd still be a below-WAR player. Vaughn did not make changes until he bottomed out and was sent to the minors and traded. It took Vaughn hitting rock bottom to force him to make changes. This happens in all walks of life. Why has no one mentioned this? Cheers. And again, thanks, Bob. I did talk about it on Monday's episode. He did send it before, but again, I just want to reiterate it. And I'm going to try to get Chris Lanuti from Sox in the Basement to give a really good analogy. And you should check out Sox in the Basement after you've checked out me, obviously, because, again, I can play well in the sandbox. But, yeah, we got to stop saying that this is an indictment on the White Sox. There are Vaughn truthers, and you'll never convince them. And, hey, if you want to be a Vaughn truther, good for you. I was once one of them. I just got tired of thinking that it's going to happen. It wasn't. It was never going to happen on the South Side. The only thing that you can maybe, again, put on the White Sox is could they have tried the swing change, basically stand them up like the Brewers did. But we don't know if they did or did not. I mean, they made a change with Miguel Vargas, and it was a slight change, just like what the Brewers did. So maybe they did, and Vaughn was like, no, I'm going to hit at some point because I always hit, like he told John Triffin. And it did probably take him, as Pat Murphy said, got to bottom out. And I know the Brewers on the other side. Andrew Vaughn, at the end of the day, we all have, can everybody just agree? Andrew Vaughn is a supporting cast player, and he's in an exact spot where he can be a supporting cast player. On the South Side, he was not going to be counted on as a supporting cast player because, 1, he was the number 3 overall pick in the 2019 draft, and 2, he plays a legendary position even though it's been devalued. That happened. Now, hopefully, that he's out, the White Sox can actually join the rest. Sorry, I'm battling a little bit of a cold. Can join the rest of the league, and where all you're looking for out of your first baseman is power. That and to catch the ball thrown to you. That's it. That is what first base has become. Sorry, but that is literally what it is. All right. Then Bob writes again. Sure, I root for Cleveland, Minnesota, and Detroit to lose. 3 teams are in the Sox division, but growing up listening to WSCR or reading the Tribune, actually it was the Daily Herald, yes, it's a Cubs town, and they will get more conversation, but the better the Sox were and the worse the Cubs were, it increased the chances to hear more and read more about my White Sox. So I root for both my White Sox to win and the Cubs to lose. It's bad enough that ESPN and the East Coast forgets about the White Sox, but growing up, sometimes the Chicago media did too, Bob. And yeah, I mean, the Cubs do tend to get more coverage, obviously, when they're winning. And it's also boring coverage. I mean, I'm sorry. I've had to turn. I'm a score guy. I will listen to ESPN 1000, but there are times where it's like the moment they talk Cubs, I'm like, I can't listen because it's boring because it's more the analytical stuff. I actually don't mind the White Sox talk because at least they're usually being humorous and bagging on the White Sox. And again, the White Sox talk, and maybe I'm biased. It's more exciting. Like with the Cubs, it's like, well, PCA doesn't regress and gets a little bit better. If they can add a little bit more power, they can win a World Series. That's talk. And obviously it's frustration, but I get it. And you're right. It does seem like the Cubs will always get the headlines because they are the more popular team in Chicago. But whose fault is that? I blame that on owner Jerry Reinsdorf. I do, because he took the White Sox onto cable and he made a boatload of money. But again, he alienated us all because he never really spent that money. And then, or they didn't spend it wisely, going back to the first segment, use these roster spaces wisely. But, he took them off, and the Cubs, were on WGN. They became a national brand. And you had a cultural icon hat. You could have continued to make them a national brand, but you kept, being like, well, I just want them on regional. And I'm not saying it wasn't the end of the world, but you should have kept spending after you signed Albert Bell. Instead, you gave the white flag trade, and you led the cause to basically, have the players dig in for that 1994 strike. So yeah, that's one reason I do blame them is some of it is self-inflicted. But I agree with you. That is one reason to root against the Cubs, because there does seem to be a huge Cubs bias, not only in Chicago, but nationally. Because remember, 2005 happened. Well, that wraps up this edition of Locked On White Sox. Thank you for making Locked On White Sox your first listen every day. For your second listen, check out Locked On MLB Game Night, every game, every night until World Series champions crowned. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find MLB Game Night on Locked On MLB on YouTube or listen to your podcast. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Way Back Wednesday segment. Feel free to leave comments about today's discussion on the episode page on YouTube via email, lockedonwhitesox@gmail.com, or leave them at X, formerly Twitter, at LockedOnSox or at Todd J. Dub. Also, make sure to leave today. Also, make sure to like today's episode and on YouTube, or leave a 5-star review at wherever you get your podcast. Have a great day, and I will talk to you tomorrow.